the time, we don't feel like it's providential. But when we look back and when we look at the difference it made, when we look at the way we responded and they responded to us and the way that, when we look at the transition point or the defining moment that relationship ultimately turned out to be, it's like, wow, it's as if God providentially dropped them into our life. It was like divine intervention. In fact, for you, don't raise your hand, it might have been an actual intervention. Some people showed up or a person showed up and they got in your face. They put their nose in your business and you were so resistant and you were so hesitant and you said things you regret and you had such a bad attitude. But as it turned out, what they told you was exactly what you needed to hear. And when you look back on that relationship or that conversation or that intervention, you're like, oh, thank God that they had the courage to step in and say the things I needed to hear, even though I didn't necessarily want to hear them. And it's possible, I would guess, that many of us have played that role in somebody else's life as well. But we didn't know it. We were just being a good friend. But they look back on that friendship and they say, you were the person. Yeah, we were just being a good citizen. We just showed up and stopped to help somebody. And for the rest of their life, you're a part of their story. You were just being a good boss. But for the person on the other side of that relationship or that encounter, for them, it almost feels providential. And when they tell their story, when they tell that story of transition, that story where their life began to take a different turn or moved in a different direction, they mention you because it was as if God dropped you into their life. Now, defining moments in life in general, defining moment is that, hinge point or that, that major turn in life. Defining moments are most always relational, right? Good relationship or a bad relationship. Somebody you're so glad they came into your life, somebody you wish had never come into your life. But the defining moments in life are generally relational in nature. So we shouldn't be surprised that God uses relationships to grow our faith, right? In fact, interestingly enough, this is how Christianity began. Here's how Christianity began. John, who knew Jesus, spent 3.5 years with Jesus, and then he's an old man. I say this all the time. He's an old man, and he's getting his story out, and he's trying to figure out, how do I begin this story that is going to be hard for anybody to even believe? And he's like, how do I start this? How do I start this? And he goes, oh, I know how to start it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh, and the Word dwelt among us. That God, this is why relationships are part of a faith, grow our faith, and this is how Christianity began. God became one of us and intersected with us. And in doing so, our faith got bigger. He showed up on planet Earth and he began to call common men and common women to follow him. And when they followed and when they obeyed and their faith intersected with the faithfulness of Jesus in the first century, something happened on the inside of them. This is how it's been happening since day one. That providential relationships are one of the primary ways God uses to grow our faith. In fact, there's kind of a cool story I'll talk about this real quick. Because not only did Jesus intersect with the lives of people, those people that intersected with other people's lives and turned out to be providential relationships. So Jesus calls Philip to be one of his disciples, one of his apostles. Philip, I want you to follow me. And Philip, this is kind of cool. Philip says, okay, but I need you to wait right here for just a minute. Jesus, just hang on. And Philip goes and he finds his friend Nathaniel. And when he finds Nathaniel, Nathaniel's a skeptic. I mean, you're a skeptic, Nathaniel's a skeptic. And Philip's like, okay, how am I going to get Nathaniel to believe me? And he just kind of blurts it out, Nathaniel, we've met this guy and we believe he's the Messiah. He's God's Holy One that he sent to, take things forward. And this is the next iteration of God's plan for planet Earth. And Nathaniel looks at Philip and he's like, no, he's not. He's not sure. I mean, people have been saying that for hundreds of years. And besides, didn't you say Jesus of Nazareth? He's from Nazareth. Seriously? Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? I mean, this is Jesus' hometown. It's like, okay, not only do I not believe you, there's no way the Messiah came from Nazareth. Now, at that point, Philip should have said, okay, suit yourself. I'm going to go change the world. You just stay here and do whatever you're doing. You're not going to get to be in the story. Nobody's going to know your name. They're going to know my name, okay? And Philip could have just walked off. But Philip is like, no way. This guy, my friend, needs to meet this man that I'm sure is the Messiah. And I love this. Philip says, okay, I can't answer your theological questions. I don't know if the Messiah is supposed to come from Nazareth or not. And no, I don't know any cool people from Nazareth. But Philip, just come and see. Come and see. Come and see. And Nathaniel's like, all right. And he follows Philip and he meets Jesus. And his life changes. And now he's one of Jesus' apostles. And he got a ringside seat for the salvation of the world because Philip just wouldn't give up. And for the rest of his life, don't you know, for the rest of his life, Nathaniel's like, every other week, Philip, I know I've already said thank you. I cannot thank you enough. Now, when I read that story, it reminds me of something that happened to Sandra and me that I want to tell you real quick, then I'm going to look at another passage of scripture. Many years ago, and I promise I'm not making this up. I mean, I'm saying it live, so I'm not making this up. Many years ago, a couple, Tim and Carla Liff, moved from the Northeast to Atlanta. They had a neighbor named Jim, and Tim and Carla didn't go to church anywhere, didn't seem to be interested. And Jim was absolutely convinced that Tim and Carla needed faith and needed Jesus and needed to go to church. So he began inviting them to his church, and he doesn't attend any of our churches, to his local church, not too far from here. And so reluctantly, Tim and Carla were like, oh, okay, we'll go. So they went, and it was kind of a special event thing for on Special Sunday, I think. So every other 2 or 3 weeks or so, every 2 or 3 weeks, Jim would invite Tim and Carla to church. And they didn't like it. They were just being polite. And finally, Tim told Carla, okay, you go, I'm not going. And so Carla communicated to Jim, thank you for inviting us. It's just not our thing. It's just not what we do. So now Jim, like Philip, could have been like, okay, did my deal. I invited my lost, far from God neighbors to church, and they turned me down, been persecuted, for the faith. I don't know. So Jim, though, decides, okay, and so he says to Tim and Carla, okay, all right, give me one more chance. I'm going to take you to a different church. And he tried to bring them here to North Point Community Church. Now, he doesn't even go here, but he is so adamant. These folks, they need faith. So Tim's like, I'm not going. We already did that. Carla's like, okay, she was a little bit more open. So he picks Carla up and brings her to the 9 o'clock service here at North Point Community Church, sits through the service. On the way back home to drop her off, he kind of navigates and explains what just happened, because what happens here was very different than the kind of church she grew up in. Very different. And so drops her off, and then he goes to his church to the 11 o'clock service. Next Sunday does the same thing. He did this. He brought Carla here to the 9 o'clock so that he could get back to his church for the 11 o'clock. So many weeks that finally their 2 kids said to their dad, Dad, where does Mr. Jim and Mommy go on Sunday morning? And Tim's like, well, he's taken her to this different church. Well, eventually, Carla brings the kids. They love it. In fact, their oldest son and my son, Andrew, became friends or lifelong friends. And eventually, Tim came. And this week, when I called Carla to make sure I had the details of the story right, she said, this is her quote, and the rest is history. And they're so grateful to Jim. This just has to happen. It was, in their minds, the way they see it, even though Jim's just kind of doing his thing, it was a providential relationship. It's like God just brought them and just dropped him right into their lives as neighbors. They had no idea. And the fact that he would bring them here, then go back to his own church, it's amazing. Well, anyway, I met Tim on the baseball field. Our sons played baseball together. They got super involved. Tim joined a guest services team. Some of you know Tim left. Time goes by that they joined our community group, and then we got to hear this. This is how we heard that amazing story. And they just began to grow in their faith, and it was just so fun to watch them grow. And then in 2013, Tim was diagnosed with ALS. So this horrible, horrible disease. And so they were still in our community group. So we decided we would just turn our community group into the Tim and Carla, support group, not literally, but hey, we're going to stay with you. They gave Tim 3 to 5 years. That was 2013. Tim is still alive today. And so what we witnessed in our community group, and Sandra, if she was here, she would tell you, watching Tim and Carla navigate this horrible, horrible disease with such extraordinary faith and joy and confidence in God, I'm telling you, it has done as much or more for my adult faith than anything I have ever experienced. So we're, Team Tim. So, several of us from time to time, a lot of us every year would go to the ALS Walk to Defeat ALS. And so on one particular afternoon I was there, and I took this picture. I want to show you this picture real quick. Okay, here's the interesting thing about this picture. This is not Tim. This is Tim. Tim kind of walked in this particular day, and this was a guy in his support group who was a little bit older, who has since passed away. And I watched, Tim was saying hi to us, and then he saw his friend. He immediately went over, dropped to his knee, and just took him in his arms. And I took that picture. And this is what he did. I'm pretty sure, I haven't asked him, I think he has survived everybody in his ALS support groups because he's going on year 8. And he has slowly deteriorated as this disease does to the human body. But I'm telling you, watching, in fact, Tim and Carl are in our community group, and Tim began to lose his voice, and now he can barely talk at all. It's really difficult to understand him, and we kind of laugh about that sometimes. But as he began to lose his ability to speak, he said to me, he said, Andy, he said, I would like to lead our community group discussion as much as possible until I can't lead anymore. It's just been one of the most inspiring things. So if you ask me, Andy, who are the, providential relationships, the people that God has used to blow up and grow up your faith? Tim and Carla Liff and their story, big part of our lives and what God has used to grow our faith. So many stories, so many interesting things. He kept trying to quit the guest services team here. And those of you who were on his guest services team, you would not let him quit. Finally, it was difficult for him to walk, so you put him in a golf cart. When it became difficult for him to speak, this is kind of funny, they matched him up with a middle school girl. So he did the driving, she did the talking. It's just, anyway, there are more and more stories. But anyway, but this is just how God does things. Now, when it comes to providential relationships, unlike some of the other things that God uses to grow up our faith, you can't create a providential relationship, right? You can't say, I'm going to go create a providential relationship. If you could create it, it wouldn't be providential, right? But here's what we can do, and here's what all of us should do, especially if you feel like you're losing faith, even if you feel like you've lost faith. We can and should be proactive in relationships with people whose faith informs their decisions and whose faith informs their responses. That one of the best things we can do for our own faith is make sure we are in lockstep. We're doing life with a group of people whose faith in God informs their decisions and informs their responses. Because watching God work through them does something to our faith. Now, the author of Hebrews is a New Testament, we call it a New Testament book. It was actually a sermon, like a long sermon that somebody wrote out. We don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews or the sermon of Hebrews, but it's so fascinating. And it was written specifically to a group of Judeans and Galileans who were beginning to lose, or he was concerned, the author, we assume it's a he, felt as if this group was beginning to lose a little bit of their confidence, not in God, but in Jesus, because they were already the sons and daughters of Abraham. They were, we would call them Jewish. So their faith is kind of waffling. So he part of this letter, he addresses their faith, and he's saying, hey, come on, hang in there. And he writes this. He says, let us, the whole, faith community, let us hold, I love this word, unswervingly. You know what it means to swerve. So unswervingly, straight. Let us hold, let us stay spot on in the hope that we profess, for he who promised, and there's our word, is faithful. He's like, wait, don't drift away from your faith. Don't become faithless just because you can't understand why what's happening in the world is happening, just because you can't explain why what's happening to you has happened. He says, come on, let's remain faithful. And then he says, and to facilitate your faithfulness and to facilitate our holding unswervingly to our faith, he says this, and let us consider, that is, let us think about it. Give this some thought. This is what I want you to do today. He says, I want you to give some thought to how we can spur each other on toward love and good deeds. He says, so as you're hanging on to your faith, I want you to look around and I want you to identify the people that you can encourage them in their faith and they can encourage you in your faith. And there may be some people who have really begun to lose interest, and I want you to have some maybe challenging conversations and say, come on, let's get back in this thing. Don't lose sight of your faith. Don't drift away. And I love that he says, and this isn't just cerebral. This isn't just believing a lot of things. This is the kind of faith that go back. Thank you. This is the kind of faith that shows up in actions and attitudes of love, responses of love, and good deeds. In other words, this is active, real world, gritty faith. So give it some thought. Give it some thought. Not just what we believe, but what we do with it. And then he makes a statement that during the year 2020, at least 100 people sent me this verse, because I guess they thought I didn't know it was in the New Testament. But this was the verse I got all throughout 2020. Ready? Here it is. And not giving up meeting together. People sent me this verse all throughout. Some of you sent me this verse throughout 2020. It's like, Andy, we've given up meeting together. I'm like, we haven't given up. We haven't abandoned. We just hit pause. And besides that, this is what I would think that I wouldn't say to anyone. Do you know how many chairs we've purchased over the last 25 years? Yeah, we have so many chairs. We're not going to give up meeting together. We have too many chairs. But anyway, so here's what he says. He says, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. So this is so interesting. He says, you're going to be tempted to lose faith, drift away from faith. He's like, but don't drift away from your faith, because when you're locked in with your faith, you're going to be more active with your faith. You're going to love better. You're going to do better. You're going to serve other people better. And he says, now, here's the thing. One of the ways that's going to keep you from losing your faith is to refuse to give up meeting together. Not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. Because from time to time, don't tell anybody, we all have doubts. From time to time, something happened that just doesn't make any sense if God is a good and loving God, right? From time to time, something happens that we can't make it fit into our worldview of God. And from time to time, we need somebody to come along and put their arm around us, or to pray with us, or to speak to us, or to kind of get in our face and say, hey, before you abandon, before you give up, let's talk about this. He says, so you've got to stay connected. Why? This is so big. Because when it comes to our faith, when it comes to our faithfulness to God, and when it comes to recognizing God's faithfulness to us, proximity matters. Proximity matters. Relationship matters, because proximity and relationship is a faith builder. Now, here's something I've observed through the years. My observation is that people tend to drift from their community of faith. That people tend to drift from their community of faith before they drift away from faith. That people have a tendency to drift first from their community of faith. They moved to a different city, they had to make a new set of friends, and they met some great people. They just weren't people of faith. Something happened and they weren't able to attend that Bible study anymore, that campus ministry anymore, or they graduated from college and went somewhere else, and suddenly they found themselves without a community of faith, or you began working and your work schedule didn't allow you to connect with your community of faith. But people generally drift away from their community of faith before they drift away from faith. People lose faith when they lose contact with people of faith. In fact, this may be your story, or this may explain your story. And again, all of this points back to why relationships are critical to growing our personal faith. When we see, as is the case with Tim and Carla, and as is the case with Tim and Carla and Jim, when we see God's faithfulness in someone else's life, it's easier to trust him with ours, right? When you see God's faithfulness in someone else's life, it's so much easier to trust him with ours. Now, while most of us, I would probably guess, while most of us have experienced this in some unexpected, out of the blue kind of way, where God sort of dropped somebody into our life, or somebody came along at just the right time, this is something that we can and should be intentional about as well, because we have a role to play in this. Again, we can't create providential relationships, but we can make decisions personally and as families and corporately that establish or help us set ourselves up for those kinds of relationships. Staying connected to a community of faith actually grows our faith. And we have the option, we have the power over whether or not we choose to stay connected to a community of faith. And doing so positions us, this is the cool part, positions us to play a role in someone else's faith journey as well. Just being in proximity with other believers, you're doing more for them than you'll ever know, just as you're aware at times that they're doing more for you than they'll ever be aware of. So when we launched our church 25 years ago, these 5 things were front and center. So we did our best to build our entire church model around these 5 things, specifically around this idea of providential relationships. We knew we couldn't program relationships, but we knew we could organize in such a way that it could increase the possibility or the capacity for people to meet in such a way that those relationships would become providential. Case in point, community groups. The fact that Tim and Carla were in our community group when he was diagnosed with ALS, and to see what God has done for them through our group and what God has done in our faith through just their experience. Again, you can't create a providential relationship, but by building our entire adult ministry model around small groups, it creates the capacity for that and the potential for that. And many of you, your part of your faith journey story would be meeting people in a small group, meeting people in a home. You didn't know anybody. You weren't sure you even liked some of these people. And over time, because of what happened relationally, and then over time, because of what happened circumstantially, God used these people that started off as strangers as a catalyst for your own personal faith. It's one of the reasons, I know last week, several hundred of you said you're going to step in and help us with family ministry. One of the reasons we do family ministry the way we do with children, middle school, and high school students is this very idea. This is why when children have a group leader, that group leader stays with them for several years, or all the way through middle school, or all the way through high school. Because we've learned the longer people are together, the more capacity and potential there is for those relationships to become catalytic in faith and providential. In fact, this is one of the best things that we've done. There's been such a huge payoff because the relationship between the group leader and kids, the relationship between the group leader and a middle schooler, the relationship between the group leader and a high school student is really more important than the content that's taught. This is why, if you're a parent, you need to have your kids here every week possible, because the consistency of that relationship in terms of that small group leader, basically they're going to be a partner with you in your parenting, because the relationship becomes catalytic, and the relationship, again, has the potential to grow up and blow up their faith. And here's the other thing. So many times through the years, when I see somebody with a Woombaland shirt on or Upstreet shirt, that's our preschool and our children's age ministries if you're joining us for the first time, or a Transit t-shirt, that's middle school, or Inside Out, and I'll say to those leaders, I see them out in the community or, all over the place, I'll say, thank you for serving. Do you know what I hear at least half the time? No, Andy, being with these kids has done more for my faith than I've done for theirs. I've heard that so many times. Why? Because there's just a mutual thing that happens in terms of fueling one another's faith through these kinds of relationships. So we've done that intentionally, for that very reason. And it's the other reason, before we, quit meeting for a while, that I was encouraging you like crazy, and I'm going to continue to encourage you to invite someone to come sit with you. This is the simplest invitation in the world. Hey, would you come sit with me? I'm not just going to invite you to my church. I quit doing that years ago. Come sit with me. Come sit with me. We did it this week. Sandra and I was on the phone. Hey, well, if you don't live that far away, come sit with us. And it's like, you let us sit with you? We're like, of course, just come sit with me. A single invitation. Some of you are the product of this. Or as part of your story, I should say. A single invitation could position you as a catalyst in someone's faith story. Think about Jim. He invited, then switched churches. Invited. It's amazing, right? So a single invitation, you have no idea, could be a catalyst to be a significant part of someone's faith story. An invitation, it could be an invitation that would serve as a first step to somebody perhaps rediscovering faith after being away from faith for a long, long time, maybe several seasons of life. We never know what hangs in the balance. We never know what hangs in the balance of a simple invitation and the courage to say something, even though we're scared to death. Now, we tell students all the time in middle school and high school, we say this, we came up with this phrase, it's one of our big ideas for students, that your friends determine the direction and quality of your life. We've been teaching that for years. Your friends determine the direction and quality of your life. Your friends determine the direction and the quality of your life. But what's true for 14-year-olds, is true for 40-year-olds as well, right? The people that we choose to do life with, influence the direction of our lives and the depth and the endurance of our faith. Again, one last time. When we see God's faithfulness in someone else's life, it is easier to trust him with ours. When we are in connection, when we're in the type of relationship where we are tracking along with what God is doing or what God seems to not be doing, what's happening in someone else's life, and they're people of faith, when we're tracking along with, we're in that kind of proximity with those kinds of people, something happens in our faith as well, and it's possibly happening through us in theirs. So when we trust God with our lives, our faith gets bigger. And when we're in proximity with people whose faith is getting bigger because they're trusting God with their life, our faith gets bigger as well. So Last thing, if you, in this crazy season we've just come through, have unplugged from a community of faith, if you have become disconnected from a set of friends that were kind of doing life the way you did life and saw the world the way you saw it, if you've become disconnected during this season from a community of faith, it's time to reconnect. You need to be proactive. Don't just wait for God to drop someone into your life. He may or he may not, but you and I have an opportunity and you and I have a responsibility to be proactive. And if you know someone who needs to connect, make that call. Why not? Who knows? Who knows? That simple invitation may turn out to be providential. In other words, when they tell their faith story, they'll talk about you. And perhaps when you tell your faith story, you'll end up talking about them as well. Providential relationships. When we see God's faithfulness in someone else's life, it is much easier to trust him with ours. This is one of the 5 things that God uses in a big way, in a consistent way, to grow up and to blow up our faith. And I don't want you to miss it. And we will pick it up right there next time as we explore the 4th thing that God uses to build enduring faith.
So as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a couple of discussion questions, something to talk about with your family on the ride home or over dinner or lunch as you head out today, or maybe in your small group. So think about these questions as you talk together, and we'll put them up on the screen for you. Can you think of someone who God providentially brought into your life at just the right time? And the second question kind of echoes that. You might be hesitant to acknowledge it, but were you someone that God providentially brought into someone else's life? And were you reluctant at first? And the third question, are the people whose stories shaped and strengthened your faith aware of the part that they played? And what would happen if you let them know how meaningful they were in your journey? Just a couple of things to think about as we take these ideas from something we are listening to something that we are living out in our lives. And I hope that you'll continue to allow this message to play in your head over the next weeks and even as we head through the summer, and that you'll put them into action as we jump into August, because that's when we're going to be relaunching small groups. And some of you are currently in a group. Maybe that group is winding down. August is the perfect opportunity to jump into a new group as it takes off. Maybe you've never been in a group, or maybe it's been a really long time. But relationships are key to our journey, both in the ones we invest in and the ones that people invest in us. So keep that in mind. And speaking of the summer months, in just a couple of weeks, it will be Memorial Day weekend, and we will not be having a service here on Memorial Day weekend. And the reason for that is it is an opportunity for us to give that day as a gift to our extraordinary volunteers. And there are so many who help the services happen, help our family ministry environments happen. And on that weekend, it gives us a chance to let them spend time with their family and friends. And so on Memorial Day weekend, we will not have any services here at the church. I just want you to be aware of that and planning for that as we head into the next couple of weeks. If you're our guest today, don't forget to swing by the studio and pick up your gift that we have waiting for you. And if you are newer to our church, I would love for you to stay right where you are as we dismiss for that 15-minute event called Next. We'll watch your kids. They're doing great down the hall. And just stick around for those 15 minutes as we give you a quick sneak peek behind the scenes of our church and some of the things that it offers you and your family. But I hope that you'll come back next week for our next part in this series, and I look forward to seeing you then.
You know you can call me if you need someone. I'll pick up the pieces if you come undone.